The snow came without warning that February afternoon in 1884, transforming the Montana Territory from a frozen prairie into a whiteout nightmare within minutes. And Jake Morrison knew he should have listened to the old Crow woman who had warned him about riding out alone when the sky held that peculiar gray heaviness that spoke of nature's fury waiting to be unleashed. Jake had been tracking a mare that had broken loose from his ranch 3 days prior, following her hoof prints through the sparse winter grass and frozen earth, but now the blizzard swallowed everything in sheets of white that stung his eyes and made his gelding, Ranger, snort nervously beneath him. He pulled his wool coat tighter, the sheepskin collar doing little to stop the wind from cutting through to his bones. At 26 years old, Jake had survived worse storms, but this one carried a particular viciousness that made even a seasoned cowboy question his mortality. He was about to turn Ranger back toward what he hoped was south when he saw the dark shape huddled against an outcropping of rock. At first he thought it might be a deer or perhaps a calf separated from a herd, but as he urged Ranger closer, his heart lurched in his chest. It was a woman, curled into herself, her dark hair plastered against her face by snow and ice, her body trembling so violently he could see it even through the driving storm. "Ma'am!" he shouted over the howling wind, swinging down from his saddle. His boots hit the frozen ground hard, and he stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside her. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death, and her eyes, when they fluttered open briefly, held a glazed quality that told him she was already slipping away into the cold sleep that claimed so many in these unforgiving winters. She wore only a thin cotton dress, torn and muddy, completely inadequate for the weather. No coat, no gloves, nothing but that dress and a pair of worn leather shoes that were soaked through. Questions could wait. Jake knew he had maybe minutes to act before the cold took her completely. "I have got you," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shaking form, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel every bone through the wet fabric of her dress. He hoisted her up onto Ranger's saddle, then swung up behind her, pulling her back against his chest and wrapping both arms around her to hold her secure and share what little warmth his body could offer. The woman made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Jake could feel her violent shivering through his shirt, and he pressed her closer, trying to shield her from the worst of the wind with his own body. "Stay with me," he murmured into her ear, his breath creating small clouds in the frozen air. "I am getting you to shelter. Just hold on." He knew of an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles northeast, assuming he could find it in this whiteout. The alternative was trying to make it back to his ranch, which was a good 6 miles away, and he knew instinctively that this woman did not have 6 miles left in her. 2 miles. They could make 2 miles. Jake urged Ranger forward, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own sense of direction. The gelding was smart, bred from good stock, and had gotten Jake out of tight spots before. The wind screamed around them, and snow accumulated on Jake's hat brim so thick he had to keep shaking it off to see even a few feet ahead. The woman in his arms had stopped shivering quite so violently, which worried him more than the shaking had. When the body stopped fighting the cold, death was not far behind. "Talk to me," he said loudly, jostling her slightly. "What is your name? Can you tell me your name?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Jake swore under his breath and held her tighter, his arms aching from the effort of keeping her upright and pressed against him. His own body was growing numb now, his fingers stiff inside his gloves, his face raw from the wind. But he had weathered worse, and more importantly, he had something to fight for now. Time became meaningless in the storm. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours when Ranger suddenly nickered and changed direction slightly. Jake peered through the snow and felt a rush of relief so intense it made him dizzy. There, barely visible through the white curtain, stood the dark shape of the cabin. "Good boy," he breathed, patting Ranger's neck with one frozen hand while keeping the other locked around the woman. "Good boy." The cabin was small, barely more than one room with a lean-to for animals, but it had a roof and walls, and that was all that mattered. Jake dismounted awkwardly, pulling the woman down with him, and kicked the door open. Inside was dark and cold, but blessedly free from the wind. He laid her on the dirt floor gently, then stumbled back out to bring Ranger into the lean-to. The horse deserved every comfort Jake could provide. Once Ranger was as settled as possible, with the saddle off and a blanket thrown over his steaming back, Jake returned to the cabin. His hands shook as he fumbled with his flint and steel, trying to get a spark to catch in the old fire pit. Previous occupants had left a small stack of wood, dry and perfect, and Jake said a silent prayer of thanks to whoever had shown that kindness to future travelers. The fire caught on his third try, and he fed it carefully until flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman. She lay where he had left her, still wrapped in his coat, barely breathing. Jake knew what he had to do, and he worked quickly, his frontier practicality overriding any concerns about propriety. He peeled the wet dress off her carefully, trying to preserve what modesty he could while recognizing that wet clothing would kill her faster than anything else. Underneath she wore a thin chemise, also soaked through, and he removed that too, wrapping her instead in every dry blanket he could find in the cabin's storage chest. Her skin was like ice beneath his fingers, and purple bruises marked her arms and ribs. Jake felt anger rise hot in his chest. Someone had hurt her. Someone had beaten this woman, and then she had ended up out in a blizzard in nothing but a cotton dress. The story there was likely ugly, but that was a concern for later. Right now he needed to warm her. He pulled her close to the fire, rubbing her arms and legs through the blankets, trying to stimulate circulation. Her breathing remained shallow, her lips still that terrifying shade of blue. Jake had seen men die from exposure before, had watched the cold claim them despite every effort to save them, and he refused to let that happen to this woman. "Come on," he urged, chafing her hands between his own. "Come back, come on." For what felt like hours, he worked on her, warming water from his canteen over the fire and using a cloth to drip it between her lips, rubbing her limbs, keeping the fire fed and hot. The storm raged outside, wind shrieking around the cabin's corners, but inside the small space grew warm and smoky. Finally, as full darkness fell, her eyelids fluttered. Jake leaned forward, his heart pounding. "That is it. Open your eyes. Come on back." Her eyes opened slowly, and he found himself looking into the deepest brown eyes he had ever seen, though they were currently glazed with confusion and pain. She stared at him for a long moment, her brow furrowing, and then she tried to sit up. "Easy," Jake said, gently pressing her shoulder back down. "You are safe. You were caught in the storm. I found you and brought you here." "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked. "Old Trapper's cabin, about 8 miles northeast of Elk Ridge. I am Jake Morrison. I have got a ranch not far from here." She closed her eyes again, and for a moment he thought she had passed out, but then she spoke. "My name is Sarah. Sarah Collins." "Well, Sarah Collins, you gave me quite a scare. What were you doing out in this storm with no coat?" Her face crumpled, and tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "I ran. I just ran." Jake did not press. He had seen those bruises. He could guess what she was running from, at least in general terms. Instead, he reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of dried beef. "Can you eat something?" She shook her head, but he insisted, breaking off small pieces and feeding them to her slowly. She managed a few bites before turning her face away, exhausted by even that small effort. Jake let her rest, sitting back on his heels and watching the fire. The storm continued through the night, and Jake dozed fitfully, sitting with his back against the cabin wall, keeping the fire going, checking on Sarah every hour or so. She slept deeply, the sleep of complete exhaustion, and gradually the color returned to her face. By morning, when pale gray light seeped through the gaps in the cabin walls, she was breathing normally and the terrible chill had left her skin. Jake stepped outside to check on the weather and found the world transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind snowdrifts that came up to his thighs in a sky of brittle blue clarity. Everything sparkled in the dawn light, beautiful and deadly. They would not be traveling today, maybe not tomorrow either, depending on how quickly the trails became passable again. He tended to Ranger first, giving the gelding water and the last of the grain from his saddlebags, then returned to the cabin. Sarah was awake, sitting up with the blankets clutched around her, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. "Morning," Jake said, keeping his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Cold, sore." She looked down at herself, seeming to realize for the first time that she was naked under the blankets, and color flooded her pale cheeks. "My dress was soaking wet and would have killed you. I hung it by the fire to dry. It should be ready soon." He busied himself with the fire, giving her privacy to process. "We are stuck here for at least a day, maybe 2. Storm dropped too much snow to travel safely." Sarah nodded, pulling the blankets tighter. "Thank you for saving me. I would have died out there." "Yes, you would have." Jake settled across the fire from her, studying her in the morning light. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features and dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. Even battered and bruised, she was beautiful. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" She was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, drained of emotion. "I was married to a man named Robert Collins. We have had a homestead about 10 miles south of Elk Ridge. He was not a good man. He drank, and when he drank, he got mean." Jake waited, not interrupting, letting her tell it in her own time. "Yesterday morning, he started drinking early. By noon, he was in one of his rages. He had lost money gambling in town, blamed me for it somehow. Said I brought him bad luck, that everything wrong in his life was my fault." She touched her ribs gingerly. "He beat me worse than usual. I thought he might actually kill me this time. So when he passed out, I ran. I just ran. I did not even think about a coat or supplies. I just knew I had to get away." "And the storm caught you." "I did not even notice it starting. I was just running, not paying attention to anything but getting away. By the time I realized how bad it was, I was already lost." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I sat down by those rocks thinking I was going to die, and then you came." Jake felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it startled him. He barely knew this woman, had only pulled her from the snow last night, but something in her vulnerability, her strength in surviving what she had, called to something deep in his chest. "You are safe now. He cannot hurt you anymore. You do not understand. He will look for me. When the storm clears and he sobers up, he will come looking. He does not like losing his property. You are not property. You are a person." Jake spoke firmly. "And you do not have to go back to him. There are laws even out here." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Laws? Sheriff Patterson drinks with Robert every Saturday. They are friends. Who do you think he would believe? A drunk homesteader or his wife who probably provoked him?" Jake could not argue with that. He had seen how justice worked in small frontier towns, and it rarely favored women in situations like this. "Then you will come back to my ranch. You can stay there, work if you want, until we figure something out." "I cannot ask that of you. You do not even know me." "You are not asking. I am offering. I've got a big house, mostly empty since my mother passed 2 years back. I could use help with the cooking and such anyway. And my ranch hands are good men. They would not let anyone hurt you." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Jake found himself hoping she would say yes, surprising himself with the intensity of that hope. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, thank you. I will work hard, I promise. I can cook and clean and sew, and I am good with animals." "Then it is settled. Once the trail's clear, we head to the Morrison ranch." They spent the rest of that day trapped in the cabin talking in fits and starts. Sarah's dress dried by the fire, and she dressed behind a blanket Jake rigged up for her privacy, emerging looking more herself despite the bruises darkening her face. Jake shared his supplies, which were meager, meant only for a day trip, not an extended stay. They ate dried beef and hardtack, drank water melted from snow, and fed the fire to keep the cold at bay. As the hours passed, Jake found himself genuinely enjoying her company. Sarah was smart, quick-witted, despite her ordeal, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. She told him about growing up in Ohio, coming west with her parents when she was 16, losing them both to cholera within a month of arriving in Montana territory. Robert Collins had seemed like salvation then, a man with land and prospects, and by the time she realized what he truly was, the marriage vows had been spoken and she was trapped. Jake told her about his own life, growing up on the ranch his father had built from nothing, learning the cattle business from the ground up. His father had died 5 years back, kicked by a horse, and his mother had followed 2 years later, her heart just giving out one night in her sleep. He had 2 older brothers, but both had gone east, wanting no part of ranch life, leaving Jake to run the Morrison spread alone. "It gets lonely," he admitted, surprising himself with the confession. "The hands are good company, but it is not the same as family." "I understand lonely," Sarah said softly, and their eyes met across the fire. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, a connection that made Jake's pulse quicken. Night fell again, and they arranged themselves on opposite sides of the small cabin, Sarah wrapped in the blankets, Jake in his mostly dry coat with his saddle for a pillow. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had led him to that outcropping of rocks at exactly the right moment. 10 minutes earlier or later, and he would have ridden past, and Sarah Collins would have frozen to death in the storm. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jake ventured outside and found the snow already beginning to melt under strong sunshine, creating a wet, slushy mess that would make travel difficult, but not impossible. He made the decision to wait one more day, let the trails clear a bit more, and build Sarah's strength back up before attempting the ride to his ranch. They spent that third day much like the second, talking and resting, though Jake noticed Sarah moving around more, testing her strength. The bruises on her face had developed into spectacular purple and yellow patterns, and he knew her ribs must hurt terribly, but she did not complain. He found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way firelight played across her features, the graceful movements of her hands, the rare smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. By the 4th morning, Jake declared them ready to travel. The trails had cleared significantly, and their food was nearly gone anyway. He saddled Ranger while Sarah tidied the cabin, making sure to leave it as clean as they had found it, with fresh wood stacked by the fire for the next travelers who might need shelter. The ride back to Morrison Ranch took most of the day, with Jake in the saddle and Sarah mounted behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep her seat. He was acutely aware of her body pressed against his back, the warmth of her even through their clothes. They stopped twice to rest Ranger and let Sarah stretch, and each time Jake found himself reluctant to remount, to lose the easy conversation they had when standing face to face. The Morrison Ranch came into view in late afternoon, and Jake felt a swell of pride as he always did when cresting the final hill. The ranch house was large and well built, 2 stories of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. The barn and outbuildings were well-maintained, corrals full of good horses, and in the distance Jake could see some of his cattle grazing on the winter range. 3 men emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard. Jake's ranch hands, Chuck, Miguel, and young Tommy, all good men he trusted. They stopped short when they saw Sarah, surprise evident on their faces. "Boss, we were getting worried." Chuck said, his weathered face creasing with concern. "When that blizzard hit and you did not come back, we figured you had holed up somewhere. But still." "Found shelter in the old trapper's cabin up north," Jake said, dismounting and then helping Sarah down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "This is Sarah Collins. She got caught in the storm. Sarah, this is Chuck, Miguel, and Tommy. They help run the ranch." The three men nodded respectfully, and Jake saw no judgment in their faces, only curiosity and sympathy when they noticed Sarah's bruises. "Sarah is going to be staying with us for a while helping with the house," Jake continued. "I expect you all to make her feel welcome and safe." "Yes, sir," they chorused, and Miguel added, "Welcome, Senora Collins. If you need anything, you just ask." Jake led Sarah into the house, acutely aware that it had not had a woman's touch since his mother died. It was clean enough, he and the hands made sure of that, but it was spare and masculine, lacking the small comforts and decorations his mother had favored. "It is not much," he started, but Sarah cut him off. "It is wonderful." She turned in a slow circle in the main room, taking in the large stone fireplace, the solid furniture, the windows that let in the afternoon light. "I have not had a real home in so long." Jake showed her to the spare bedroom upstairs, the one that had been his mother's sewing room. It had a bed and a dresser and a small window overlooking the front yard. "It is yours for as long as you need it. I will have the hands bring up water for a bath if you would like. There should be some of my mother's old clothes in the trunk there. You are about the same size as she was." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I do not know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. You are part of the household now." He smiled at her, trying to ignore the way his heart thumped harder when she smiled back. "I will leave you to rest. Come down when you're ready. I will make us some supper." Jake retreated downstairs, his mind whirling. He had brought home a married woman, which could cause talk, but he did not care. Sarah needed protection and a place to heal, and he had the means to provide that. The fact that he was already half in love with her after just 4 days was a complication he would deal with later. The next week settled into a routine. Sarah took over the cooking and the household management, and Jake was amazed at the transformation. Meals became events to look forward to, with fresh bread and roasts and pies that made the ranch hands groan with pleasure. The house took on a warmth and comfort it had lacked, with small touches appearing, curtains in the windows, flowers in vases, even though they were dried arrangements from the previous summer, everything clean and ordered but homey. Sarah's bruises faded slowly, and she began to smile more often, to laugh at the stories the hands told over dinner. Jake found excuses to be in the house more often than he strictly needed to be, helping with tasks that did not really require his help. Sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking with Sarah while she kneaded bread or peeled vegetables. He learned more about her with each passing day. She loved books and had left behind a small collection when she fled her husband's homestead, something that clearly still pained her. Jake made a mental note to visit the general store in Elk Ridge and see about ordering her some new ones. She sang while she worked, old folk songs and hymns, her voice clear and sweet. She was gentle with the animals, earning Ranger's complete devotion and charming even the barn cats, and Jake fell deeper in love with each revelation, each smile, each moment of her laughter. He tried to hide it, knowing she was still legally married, still vulnerable and healing from her ordeal, but he found his eyes seeking her out constantly, his heart lifting when she entered a room. 6 weeks after he had found her in the blizzard, Jake rode into Elk Ridge for supplies. It was a small town, rough and raw, like most frontier settlements, with a main street of false-fronted buildings and a population that swelled on Saturdays when the homesteaders came in. Jake tied Ranger outside the general store and went in, making his purchases and adding several books to his order, titles he thought Sarah might enjoy. He was loading the supplies into his saddlebags when he heard a voice behind him. "Morrison!" Jake turned to find Robert Collins standing there, and even without having met the man before, he knew him instantly. Collins was average height but thick-bodied, running to fat with a red face and mean eyes. He stank of whiskey, even though it was barely noon. "Collins," Jake said evenly, "can I help you with something?" You got my wife, I want her back. Sarah is at my ranch of her own free will. She is working for me as housekeeper. Collins spat in the dirt. She is my wife. She belongs to me, and I know you got her. Heard talk in the saloon. You bring her back, or I will come get her myself. Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping low and hard. You will stay away from my ranch, Collins. Sarah does not want to see you. She is afraid of you, and given what I saw of the bruises you put on her, I cannot blame her. A man has a right to discipline his wife. A man has no right to beat a woman black and blue. Jake's hands clenched into fists. You come near my property, and I will have you arrested for trespassing. You come near Sarah, and I will make sure you regret it. Are we clear? Collins's face went even redder, but something in Jake's stance must have warned him off because he backed up a step. This is not over. Morrison, she is my wife, legal and binding. Law is on my side. Then take it up with the law, but you stay away from her. Jake swung into the saddle and rode off without looking back, his heart pounding with anger and worry. He needed to protect Sarah, but Collins was right about one thing. She was legally still his wife, and the law in these parts might well force her to return to him. When Jake got back to the ranch, he found Sarah in the kitchen, and the moment she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. What happened? He told her about the confrontation, watching her face go pale and her hands start to shake. He knows I am here. He is going to come for me. I will not let him take you. Jake moved to her without thinking, taking her hands in his. Sarah, I will protect you, I promise. We will figure something out. There is only one way I can be free of him. She looked up at him, her brown eyes steady despite her fear. I have to become a widow. Sarah, I cannot just... I am not asking you to kill him. But if something happened to him, if he had an accident or picked a fight with the wrong person, I would be free. Really free. She squeezed his hands. I know it is a terrible thing to wish for, but I cannot go back to him, Jake. I would rather die. It will not come to that. Jake pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. He rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the slender strength of her body against his. We will find another way. But over the following days, Jake could not think what that other way might be. Divorce was nearly impossible in Montana territory, requiring proof of adultery or extreme abuse, and even then required a court judgment that could take months or years. Sarah could claim abuse, certainly, but that would require her to testify to relive her trauma in front of a judge and jury who might not believe her, and Collins would be there, watching, threatening. The situation came to a head 2 weeks later. Jake was out checking the northern fence line with Miguel when they heard gunshots from the direction of the ranch house. Both men wheeled their horses around and galloped back, fear gripping Jake's chest like a vice. They arrived to find Collins on the front porch, pounding on the door and shouting for Sarah to come out. He had a pistol in one hand and was clearly drunk, swaying on his feet. Chuck and Tommy had emerged from the barn and were approaching cautiously, but Collins waved the gun at them, making them stop. Sarah, Collins bellowed, "She get out here, woman, time to come home." Jake dismounted at a run. Collins, get off my property before I have you arrested. Collins swung around, the pistol coming up. This is between me and my wife, Morrison. You got no right to keep her from me. I have every right to protect someone on my land. Jake moved slowly, hands visible, trying to get between Collins and the house. Behind him, he heard the door open, and he knew without looking that Sarah had come out. Sarah, go back inside. No. Her voice was steady, though Jake could hear the fear underneath. I will talk to him. There is nothing to talk about, Collins snarled. You are coming home, now. I am not going anywhere with you, Robert. I am done being your punching bag. Collins raised the pistol, aiming it at Sarah, and everything seemed to happen at once. Jake lunged forward, shouting. Chuck and Tommy rushed in from the side. Miguel grabbed for his own gun, and Sarah stood her ground, chin raised, staring down her husband with more courage than Jake had ever seen. The pistol went off with a crack that echoed across the yard. Jake felt a burning line across his upper arm but ignored it, tackling Collins and driving him to the porch boards. They grappled for the gun. Collins fighting with the wild strength of a drunk, Jake with cold determination. The pistol discharged again, the bullet going wild, and then Chuck was there, wrenching the weapon away. Jake pinned Collins down, breathing hard. Blood ran down his arm from where the bullet had grazed him, but it was superficial. "You just assaulted multiple witnesses," he gritted out. "Shot at your wife. Trespassed on private property. I am holding you for the sheriff, and this time you will face consequences." Collins struggled, cursing, but with Miguel and Tommy helping, they got him tied up and locked in the tack room. Jake sent Tommy riding for town to fetch Sheriff Patterson, then let Sarah fuss over his arm, cleaning and bandaging the shallow wound. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking as she wrapped the cloth around his bicep. "Because of me. Not because of you, because he is a violent drunk who does not know when to quit." Jake caught her hand, holding it against his chest. "Sarah, this is going to end. One way or another. This is going to end." Sheriff Patterson arrived near dusk, a grizzled man in his 50s with a weathered face and sharp eyes. Jake had worried he might side with his drinking buddy, but Patterson took one look at the situation, listened to the accounts of 5 witnesses, and shook his head. "Collins, you are a damned fool. Assault, trespassing, attempted murder, looks like. You are going to jail." "She is my wife," Collins shouted from the tack room. "Tell them, Patterson, tell them she belongs to me." "Being a man's wife does not give him the right to shoot at her," Patterson said wearily. "Morrison, you willing to press charges?" "Absolutely." "Mrs. Collins, you willing to testify about what happened here today and about how you came to be at the Morrison Ranch in the first place?" Sarah straightened, and Jake saw the steel in her spine. "Yes, I will testify to all of it." Patterson nodded. "Then we will have a trial. Judge Hawkins comes through Elk Ridge next month. Until then, Collins, you are a guest of the county jail." He hauled Collins out, still cursing and fighting, and loaded him into a wagon for transport to town. After they left, Sarah collapsed onto the porch steps, shaking. Jake sat beside her, putting his good arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, finally letting the tears come. He held her while she cried, murmuring reassurances, and when she finally quieted, he found himself saying the words that had been building in his chest for weeks. "I love you, Sarah. I know this is not the right time, and you are still married, and you have been through hell, but I need you to know, I love you. I have loved you since that cabin. Maybe since I pulled you off Ranger in front of this house, and when you are free of him, if you will have me, I want to marry you properly. I want you to stay here not as a housekeeper, but as my wife." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining with tears, but also with something that made his heart soar. "I love you too. I have been so afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon, or that I was just grateful or confused, but it is not any of those things. I love you, Jake Morrison. You saved my life, and then you gave me a home, and you have shown me what a good man actually is. Yes, when I am free, yes, I will marry you." Jake kissed her then gently, mindful of everything she had been through, but she kissed him back with a passion that spoke of hope and healing and new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Jake rested his forehead against hers. "We will get through this," he promised. "Together." The trial took place 5 weeks later in the Elk Ridge Courthouse, a drafty building that served double duty as a church on Sundays. Judge Hawkins was known for his fairness, a former Union officer who had seen too much brutality during the war to tolerate it in civilian life. The courtroom was packed, not just with people from Elk Ridge, but with homesteaders and ranchers from miles around, drawn by the spectacle. Jake sat in the front row with his ranch hands, a show of support for Sarah, who sat at the prosecutor's table looking pale but determined. Collins sat across the aisle, still defiant, represented by a lawyer from Helena who specialized in defending violent men. Sarah testified first, and Jake's hands clenched into fists as she described the years of abuse, the beatings, the constant fear. She showed the fading bruises still visible on her arms, described the night she ran and nearly died in the blizzard. Colin's lawyer tried to trip her up, suggesting she had provoked her husband, that she was exaggerating, but Sarah held firm, her voice never wavering. Then Jake testified, describing finding Sarah half frozen, the bruises he had seen, Collins's attack on his ranch. Chuck, Miguel, and Tommy all testified to what they had witnessed. Even Sheriff Patterson took the stand, admitting that he had heard rumors of Collins's violence but had dismissed them as marital disputes. The jury was out for less than an hour. They found Robert Collins guilty on all counts: assault, attempted murder, trespassing. Judge Hawkins sentenced him to 15 years hard labor at the Territorial Prison in Deer Lodge. Collins was dragged from the courtroom shouting threats, but Jake barely heard them. It was over. Sarah was safe. Outside the courthouse, Sarah threw herself into Jake's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "I can barely believe it. He is really gone. He is really gone. You are free." Jake swung her around, not caring who saw, and when he set her down, he kissed her right there on the courthouse steps. They were married 3 months later after Sarah's divorce was finalized. Judge Hawkins had pushed the paperwork through personally, moved by her testimony and eager to see her truly free. The wedding took place in the Morrison ranch house, with Sarah wearing a dress of cream-colored silk that Jake had ordered from a dressmaker in Helena. She had never looked more beautiful, her eyes shining with happiness, her smile radiant. Chuck and Miguel stood up for Jake, and the wife of one of the neighboring ranchers stood up for Sarah. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony in front of the big stone fireplace, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed his bride with a joy that made his chest feel too small to contain it. The celebration lasted well into the night, with food and dancing and the ranch hands getting progressively more drunk and sentimental. But eventually the guests departed or passed out in the barn, and Jake carried Sarah upstairs to their bedroom, the one that had been his but was now theirs. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, Jake careful of Sarah's past traumas, but finding in her an eager partner who met him kiss for kiss, touch for touch. Afterward, they lay tangled together and Sarah traced patterns on Jake's chest. "I never thought I could be this happy," she murmured. "A year ago I was trapped in hell, and now I am here with you and it feels like a dream." It is not a dream. It is real, and it is ours. Jake kissed the top of her head. "I promise you, Sarah Morrison, I will spend every day of my life making sure you know you are loved and cherished." "I know, I do know." She looked up at him, her brown eyes soft in the lamplight. "You already have shown me. But I am going to spend every day showing you the same thing. You saved me, Jake. In every way a person can be saved." The years that followed were the happiest of Jake's life. Sarah transformed the ranch house into a true home, warm and welcoming. She started a garden that first spring, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the Montana soil with determination and skill. She befriended the neighboring ranch wives, creating a community where one had barely existed before. She learned to ride well enough to help with the cattle sometimes, sitting a horse with grace and confidence that made Jake's heart swell with pride. She turned out to be a shrewd business mind too, helping Jake with the ranch accounts and suggesting improvements that increased their profits. The Morrison Ranch prospered under their joint management. In the fall of 1885, Sarah told Jake she was expecting their first child. Jake whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughingly demanded to be set down. He became absurdly protective, worrying over her every moment, but Sarah took it all with good humor and continued to run the household efficiently. Their son was born in May of 1886, a healthy boy with Jake's green eyes and Sarah's dark hair. They named him Thomas James Morrison after both of Jake's grandfathers, and Jake held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. Sarah, exhausted from the labor but radiant, smiled up at him. "He is perfect," Jake breathed. "You are perfect. I did not know I could love anyone more than I love you, but here he is." "We made him together," Sarah said softly. "He is proof that something good and beautiful can come even after terrible things." Thomas was an easy baby, happy and curious, and he grew like a weed. 2 years later, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Catherine Rose, named for Jake's mother. The little girl had her mother's brown eyes and a stubborn streak that promised future challenges. Jake adored both his children with a fierce devotion that sometimes surprised him. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch continued to thrive. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the horses, while Catherine was bold and adventurous, always getting into mischief. In 1890, Sarah gave birth to another son, Samuel, who had red hair that must have come from some distant ancestor and a sweet temperament that charmed everyone he met. Jake often thought back to that February day in 1884, when he had ridden out in pursuit of a lost mare and found instead the woman who would become his entire world. The blizzard that had nearly killed Sarah had instead brought her to him, a twist of fate he would be grateful for every day of his life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake took Sarah riding up to the old trapper's cabin where they had sheltered from the storm. It was still standing, though more weathered, and they went inside remembering those intense days when they had first begun to know each other. "I was so scared," Sarah admitted, looking around the small space. "I thought I was going to die in the snow. And then you appeared like something from a dream, and I thought maybe I had already died and you were an angel." Jake laughed. "I am no angel, just a cowboy who happened to be in the right place. No, you are more than that. You are the man who saw me at my lowest, my most broken, and chose to help anyway. You gave me not just shelter but a home, not just safety but love. You gave me a life, Jake, a real beautiful life." She turned to him, taking his hands. "Thank you for everything, for these 10 years and for all the years to come." Jake pulled her close, kissing her deeply. "I would ride through 1,000 blizzards for you. I would face down 100 men like Collins. You are my heart, Sarah. You and our children. You are everything." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink. Smoke rose from the chimney of their home, and Jake could see the children playing in the yard, watched over by one of the ranch hands. It was a scene of such perfect domestic contentment that it made his throat tight. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons. Thomas grew tall and responsible, learning the cattle business from his father. Catherine became an accomplished horsewoman and a crack shot with a rifle, scandalizing the neighboring ranchers' wives, but making her father intensely proud. Samuel showed an artistic bent, spending hours drawing the landscapes and animals of the ranch. In 1895, Sarah gave birth to their 4th child, another daughter they named Lily Grace. The labor was difficult, and the doctor warned them there should be no more children, but Lily arrived healthy and perfect, with blonde hair and her father's green eyes. Jake and Sarah entered middle age together, their love deepening rather than fading with time. They still stole kisses in the kitchen when they thought no one was looking. They still talked for hours, sharing their days, their dreams, their worries. They still made love with the passion of newlyweds, though now it was tempered with the comfort of long familiarity. Thomas married at 21, bringing home a sweet girl named Emma from Elk Ridge. They built a house on the ranch property, and Thomas took over more and more of the day-to-day operations as Jake began to slow down. Catherine shocked everyone by falling in love with the school teacher, a gentleman named David who adored her fierce spirit. They married and moved to Helena, where Catherine became involved in the women's suffrage movement, fighting for the right to vote with the same determination she brought to everything. Samuel went east to study art in Chicago, sending home letters full of excitement about the city and his classes. He promised to return to Montana someday to paint the landscapes he loved. Lily, the baby, grew into a lovely young woman with a kind heart and a talent for healing, studying with the town doctor with an eye toward becoming a nurse. In 1908, when Jake was 50 and Sarah was 46, they became grandparents for the first time. Thomas and Emma's son, another Thomas, arrived healthy and squalling. Jake held his grandson and felt the circle of life turning, felt the weight of responsibility and love passing to the next generation. "We did good," Sarah said, standing beside him, looking down at the baby. "Look at what we built, Jake. Our family, our home, all of it." "We did," Jake agreed. "From that blizzard to this, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." More grandchildren followed. Catherine and David had twin girls who visited every summer. Samuel eventually returned to Montana with a wife he had met in Chicago, an artist like himself, and they settled in a small cabin on the ranch property where Samuel painted and raised his own family. Lily married the town doctor's son and stayed in Elk Ridge, raising 4 children of her own. Jake and Sarah grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies moving slower, but their love remaining as strong as ever. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sunset over the mountains, holding hands and talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. When Jake was 68, he took a fall from his horse, breaking his hip. The recovery was long and difficult, and for a while the doctor thought he might not make it. But Sarah nursed him with tireless devotion, sitting by his bedside, reading to him, encouraging him, refusing to let him give up. Jake pulled through, weaker but determined to enjoy whatever time he had left. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1927, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The house overflowed with family. 3 generations of Morrisons gathered to celebrate the love that had started in a blizzard so many years before. That night, lying in bed, Sarah snuggled close to Jake, and he wrapped his arms around her as he had that first night in the cabin, holding her close and keeping her warm. 40 years, Sarah murmured. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you found me in the snow. Sometimes it feels like we have been together forever." "Both are true," Jake said. "Every day with you has been a gift, Sarah, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones because we face them together." "I love you, Jake Morrison. I loved you when you saved me from the cold. I loved you when you stood up to Robert. I loved you when you promised to protect me. And I love you now, after 40 years and 4 children and more grandchildren than I can count. You are my heart. And you are mine. Always." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms. And when morning came, they woke to find fresh snow falling outside, the first snow of the season. Jake watched it through the window, remembering another snowstorm another lifetime ago when the cold had brought him the greatest gift of his life. Jake Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1932 at the age of 74. Sarah was holding his hand, as she had held it for so many years, and when he took his last breath, she kissed his forehead and whispered that she would see him again. Sarah lived another 5 years, staying in the ranch house surrounded by her family. She spent her days with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories of the old days, of the Wild West, and the blizzard that had changed everything. She told them about their grandfather, about his courage and kindness, about the love that had sustained them through decades. On February 14, 1937, exactly 53 years to the day after Jake had found her in the snow, Sarah Morrison passed away quietly in her sleep. Her family found her in the morning, a peaceful smile on her face, her hand resting on a photograph of Jake taken in his prime. They buried her next to Jake on a hill overlooking the ranch, and at her funeral, her children and grandchildren spoke of a love story that had become legend in their family. They spoke of a cowboy who had ridden out in a blizzard and found a woman who needed saving. They spoke of the courage it took to leave an abusive marriage, the strength it took to build a new life, and the power of a love that had lasted through every trial and triumph. Thomas, now the patriarch of the Morrison clan, stood at his mother's grave and remembered the stories she had told him as a child. Stories of his father riding through a whiteout storm, of wrapping her in his coat and carrying her to safety, of days spent in a cabin while a blizzard raged outside and love grew in the warmth of a fire. Stories of standing up to bad men, of building a home, of raising a family through good times and hard. They showed us what love really is, Thomas said to his own children and grandchildren, all gathered around. Not just the romance, though there was plenty of that, but the daily choice to be kind, to be faithful, to build something together. That is what your grandmother and grandfather gave us. That is their legacy. The Morrison Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family, and with it passed the story of Jake and Sarah. Great-grandchildren who had never met them knew their names, knew the story of the blizzard and the rescue, the love that had conquered fear and built a dynasty. The old trapper's cabin where they had sheltered eventually collapsed, reclaimed by the wilderness. But the Morrison family maintained a marker there, a simple stone that read, "Here, in February 1884, Jake Morrison found Sarah Collins and changed both their lives forever. May we all be so lucky in love." And on winter evenings, when snow fell across the Montana prairie and the wind howled around the ranch house that Jake had built and Sarah had made a home, you could almost see them still. A cowboy and his bride dancing in the kitchen or sitting by the fire or standing on the porch watching the sunset. Together, always together. The story of their love became more than just a family legend. It became a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best, that salvation can come from unexpected directions, and that true love, the kind that lasts, is built not in grand gestures, but in daily choices. The choice to be kind, the choice to protect, the choice to stay through blizzards and sunshine, through youth and age, through everything life could throw at two people who had found each other against all odds. Jake Morrison had ridden out that February day looking for a lost horse and found instead his soulmate, frozen and broken but not defeated. Sarah Collins had run into a blizzard expecting to die and found instead a man who would show her what love really meant. And from that chance meeting in the worst of conditions had bloomed a love story that would be told for generations, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the human heart's infinite capacity for love. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on the Morrison Ranch, still raise cattle and horses on land that Jake claimed and Sarah helped build into something lasting. The house has been updated and expanded, but the original structure remains. The stone fireplace where Jake and Sarah spoke their wedding vows still standing strong. The family gathers there every February 14th, not just to celebrate Valentine's Day, but to remember the anniversary of the day Jake found Sarah, the day that started everything. They tell the old stories, pass them down to the newest generation, make sure that no Morrison ever forgets where they came from. They talk about the Wild West days, about blizzards and outlaws, about courage and survival, but mostly they talk about love, the kind of love that saves lives, the kind of love that builds futures, the kind of love that lasts beyond death, living on in the children and grandchildren and all the generations that follow. And sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind screams around the eaves, the Morrison family swears they can feel their presence. Jake and Sarah still watching over the family they created, still together, still in love. The cowboy who rode into a blizzard and the woman he saved, bound together by fate and choice and a love that proved stronger than any storm. Their story had a beginning in the worst of circumstances, in cold and fear and violence, but it had an ending in warmth and love and family, in lives well lived and a legacy that would never fade. From the moment Jake wrapped Sarah in his coat and rode for shelter, holding her close against the storm, their fates were sealed. Two broken people who found each other and built something beautiful, something lasting, something that would echo through the ages as proof that love, real love, can conquer anything. And so the story ends as it began, with a blizzard. But this time, the cold cannot touch them. This time, they are together, wrapped in each other's arms, warm and safe and loved forever.